First of all, let me not only thank you, but thank our host and the people of Panama who have done an extraordinary job organizing this summit. It is a great pleasure to be joined by leaders who I think have done extraordinary work in their own countries, and I've had the opportunity to work with President Rousseff and Peña Nieto on a whole host of regional, international, and bilateral issues, and very much appreciate their leadership. And clearly, President Varela is doing an outstanding job here in Panama as well. A lot of important points have already been made. Let me just say this. When I came into office in 2009, obviously we were all facing an enormous economic challenge globally. Since that time, both exports from the United States to Latin America and imports from Latin America to the United States have gone up over 50%. And it's an indication not only of the recovery that was initiated in part by important policies that were taken and steps that were taken in each of the countries in coordination through mechanisms like the G20, but also the continuing integration that's going to be taking place in this hemisphere as part of a global process of integration. And I'll just point out some trends that I think are inevitable. One's already been mentioned, that global commerce, because of technology, because of logistics, it is erasing the boundaries by which we think about businesses, not just for large companies, but also for small and medium-sized companies as well. That's point number one. Point number two is that technology is going to continue to be disruptive. I'm glad that my friend Mark Zuckerberg's here. Obviously, what he's done with Facebook has been transformative. But what's important to recognize is that it's not just companies like Apple and Google and Facebook that are being transformed by technology. Traditional industries are being changed as well. Small businesses are being changed as well. How we buy, sell, market, all that's shifting, and that's not going to go away. And what that means is that going forward, for the hemisphere to continue to experience the growth that's necessary, I think there are a couple of principles that we just have to follow. And some of them have already been mentioned, so I'll just speak to them very quickly. The first is our people have to be the best trained in the world. We have to not only educate our children, but we have to give our people the capacity to continue to learn throughout their lives, because the economy is changing and workers have to adapt. It's going to be very rare where somebody works at one place for 30 years with just one skill. So the investments that all of us have to make in education, not just through primary or secondary schools, but if young people are not going to universities, they can still at least get technical training and advanced degrees, and this is where technology can be our friend. We initiated something called 100,000 Strong to improve the exchanges between students in Latin America and the United States. And part of what we're doing is starting to figure out how can we use technology to reach more young people, not just the folks who are at the top of the economic pyramid, but reach down and access remote areas where suddenly a young person in a small village, if they are linked through the internet, have access to the entire world. And companies, I think, can play an important role because public-private partnerships will make these kinds of investments more effective. Point number two, the issue of infrastructure has already been mentioned. We have a lot of infrastructure we need to build in the United States, and obviously there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built throughout the region. The more we can coordinate and work together on infrastructure, the better off we're going to be. Just one example, I came from SICA, the meeting of Central American leaders. Their energy costs are typically 3 times higher than what we pay in the United States. It's a huge impediment to their development. To the extent that we can create a single regional energy market, then the cost of production, of transmission, distribution of energy becomes cheaper for all the countries involved, and you get certain economies of scale. And so part of what some of the Americas can accomplish is to try to work on a regional basis around some key infrastructure projects that will help us all grow. Number three, as has already been mentioned, the issue of broad-based economic development. I was very interested speaking with President Varela about Panama, seen outstanding growth, and yet there's still some remote areas where I know the President has a priority. How do I reach those communities that are isolated, that are not part of that growth process? All of us here have to deal with that, and that includes in the United States, by the way, because one of the challenges that we're all facing when you look at global growth patterns is that even when economies are growing, the gaps between rich and poor oftentimes are accelerating, and not only is that not good for social stability, not only is that not good for opportunity, it's not good for business. Because the truth of the matter is that when you have a growing middle class and an aspirational poor that are able to access their way into the middle class, then those become the consumers that drive the marketplace, much more so than folks at the very top. There's only so much food you can eat. There's only so many cars you can buy. And at a certain point, if only folks at the top are doing well and we're not focused on broad-based growth, then growth starts to stall. And so taking the steps to train, to educate, to give access to opportunity, to make sure that infrastructure is reaching every place and not just some places, that becomes a very high priority. And the last point I'll make is the issue of governance. President Varela mentioned the issue of violence, and this is obviously something that is of deep concern in many parts of the world, and sadly is still a problem in portions of the hemisphere. And a lot of it has to do with lack of opportunity. But part of it also has to do with the difficulties of establishing strong security if we also are not combining that with transparency, with government accountability, with a criminal justice system and a judicial system that is perceived as fair and legitimate. And so the work that we've begun to do together, for example, Brazil and the United States and Mexico, we're working on an open government partnership that makes sure that records are available and people understand how their government is spending their money, how contracts are let, reinforcing norms around rule of law. Not only does that give us more tools to combat violence, but it also, I suspect, makes investors a lot more interested in investing in a country if they know what the rules are and they have certainty, and political risk is reduced. And again, this is an area where we have to work regionally as opposed to separately, because the narco traffickers don't distinguish between borders. Well, that means we can't either. And fortunately, we have some outstanding partners who've been working together. Panama is one of our best partners. President Peña Nieto has been doing outstanding work with us in seeing how we can coordinate more effectively. But issues of personal security, reducing corruption, governance, those are economic agendas. Those are not simply security agendas.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Muchas gracias, Presidente Obama.
Thank you, President Obama. When I listen to President Obama, I would like to ask President Peña Nieto to tell us, when you look at Mexico, I mean, I remember that you said that you were going to make very many reforms to do what President Obama mentioned. I think that I can tell you, President Peña Nieto, that you've done in 2 years what many governments have done in 6 years, so that Mexico could go closer to modernity, which has been your dream. I would like you to share with all of these people what you've done.
Thank you so much, Luis Alberto. President Varela, thank you so much for your hospitality in organizing this summit. It's a great pleasure to share this panel with President Rousseff and President Obama. Allow me, after having heard what the global leaders of this panel have said today, let me refer to what Mexico has been doing precisely with its business community. I want to greet all the businessmen and women of all of Latin America, of the Americas that are here, entrepreneurs, and many of the leaders that are here with us. Let me tell you that the vision of Mexico on its businessmen and entrepreneurs is, at the end of the day, understanding that those that generate wealth and well-being for society at large are those people with creative capacity and the opportunity that creators and innovators can give so that we can continue with initiatives that will trigger prosperity for our societies. And this has meant a change of models, of paradigms in Latin America. And barely just 30 years ago this started. We used to be a region of the world in which the governments, we were the main generators of jobs and eventually the wealth that was being generated. And we were able to see that the governments were not sufficiently efficient for this purpose. So then we had to implement a change of the model, a new design for the region, which was that of creating pillars, creating foundations that would allow us to have the entrepreneurs of each country generate wealth and well-being for the population. In Mexico, this is what we realized, and this gave way to different changes we've been implementing as of that time. Mexico decided to open itself to the world, to compete with the world through its business community and entrepreneurs. Mexico decided to participate in other global markets with its entrepreneurs. Let me also share with you that investment of the business community, of the entrepreneurs in Mexico throughout the world, 70% is in Latin America and throughout this region of the Americas. This undoubtedly is very relevant. And in the face of this scenario, the government that I had decided that it was necessary to give more capacity and especially new foundations, new scaffolding, new mechanisms, new tools that would allow Mexico in this new route, on this new path, could have a greater economic growth and generation of prosperity for its population. And therefore, we have implemented important structural reforms. We had postponed those reforms, but through this democratic scenario and through the agreement of different expressions at the political level in Mexico, we were able to show that it is possible to have those reforms, many of them mainly aimed at promoting economic growth, and one which is very important at the educational level. Right now, the big challenge of Mexico is to go from education coverage, which in the last century it was very poor, very deficient, to have better quality education with greater coverage. This is the main strength in the training of human capital so that the population of Mexico may access tools that the world is already using, internet access, information technology access, and other reforms as well to support the entrepreneurship of our population. A financial reform to expand the credit level in Mexico, a telecommunications reform to expand competition in this sector to reduce costs of such an important input as telecommunications in the generation of wealth. And one which is also very important, undoubtedly also a paradigm for Mexico, which is the energy reform. And here we have set forth a paradigm which is for the Mexican state to maintain property of hydrocarbons. But now we're opening the opportunity for the private sector to be able to participate in all the productive chain of the energy sector. This is a new model which breaks away from what was established for over 70 years. And undoubtedly, this opens the opportunity so that entrepreneurs, business people, may generate wealth and richness in Mexico in this new window of opportunity. I would conclude by saying that it is true Mexico has postponed these changes, structural changes, for many years, but now we're implementing them with democracy. We have reached an agreement for these changes to take place. And now we are materializing, implementing, instrumenting all these reforms that will give Mexico more growth and more prosperity for its population. I would say to conclude that we are in my administration, we are taking care of the implementation of a well-defined path so that more Mexicans will be benefited through their creative capacity and their entrepreneurship. Thank you so much, Alberto.
Well, thank you very much. Now we're going to give the 5 entrepreneurs who are here to react or to respond to what the presidents have been saying. Stanley Mata is the entrepreneur that owns the line that transports us around the world. He's responsible for financial and other services. Stanley, you have the floor.
Madam President and Mr. Presidents, on behalf of the CEO Summit and the private sector of Panama, I want to thank you and the other heads of state for participating in this summit. Since Cartagena, the dialogue led by the Inter-American Development Bank has been important in helping frame the structure of what public-private partnerships should look like in the future. Public-private partnerships should include governments, private sector, civil society, and academia. Social innovation can only take place with collaboration between all the parties. We believe that governments should be the host, helping create the ecosystem needed for this collaboration. We think that one of the most important decisions the heads of state can take at this summit is to define the nature of those public-private partnerships going forward. They will determine how we all work together to achieve a more prosperous and equitable society. Please comment on this subject. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Stanley. Le daría entonces ahora la palabra a Marco Stefanini.
Thank you. I would give Marco Stefanini the floor. He is the founder of Stefanini Solutions, a multinational in Brazil. He is present in 27 countries. Marco, you have the floor.
É uma grande honra estar aqui presente com os senhores presidentes. Nesses dias, nós discutimos como nossas economias flutuam.
We have been discussing how our economies have grown as a result of the different prices of commodities, as well as the challenges facing the Americas, given the dynamic and the strong competitiveness coming from Asian countries. It is my view that the solution for the Americas would consist in true economic integration and strong cooperation among all countries in the region. We should view ourselves as allies, operating in one and the same ecosystem, and not as competitors. Quite certainly, technology and innovation should be part and parcel of this agenda of building societies marked by more added value, more efficiency, more competitiveness. My practical suggestions are as follows. Why don't we establish a roadmap where proposals and recommendations stemming from this event would serve as a key contribution and input, and also resume negotiations for an economic integration, a more fully-fledged integration in the region. Third suggestion, establish a specific alliance towards a modern, contemporary technological infrastructure, plus professional training and development systems, strong investments in content and applications. 2 questions. What is your view, presidents, on these remarks I just made? Second question, how can we take concrete steps towards advancing in a joint strategy towards innovation and entrepreneurship? I believe these are indeed the 2 key main drivers for us to build a value-based contemporary society.
Thank you. I would give the floor to Francisco Risturrieta, who is the CEO of Citigroup in Latin America. It has a very long history in Latin America, and it represents 16% of all of its income thanks to this region. Francisco, you have the floor. Well, thank you, Luis Alberto.
Varela, President Obama, President Peña Nieto, I am humbled to be this afternoon here and speaking on behalf of the Americas Business Dialogue. Like President Luis Alberto Moreno mentioned, there's a group that has been working for over a year in finding the economic challenges that we have in the region, and more importantly, identifying opportunities for partnering public and private sector together to capture those opportunities effectively. The essence of the challenge is that we need to migrate from selling commodities or raw materials to the rest of the world to converting those raw materials to added value products that bring sustainable growth and opportunities to our middle class and emerging class. Together, we need to invest in education, making sure that that middle class and that emerging class has all the opportunities possible to continue to contribute to our countries. We need to embrace integration, but that integration needs to guarantee sustainable growth above and beyond simply selling commodities to the rest of the world. That integration should also harmonize regulation to ensure that we can together generate scale. Like President Obama mentioned, the challenge of Central America and the Caribbean in terms of migrating and converting to gas and renewable sources of energy to bring costs down. A very ambitious agenda indeed. We need to make sure that we need to move capital competitively and easily within the region. So those regulations need to be harmonized, standardized, and brought to international standards to make sure that we can capture all the capital we can bring to this region sustainably over time. It is indeed a challenging agenda, an ambitious agenda, but you have the private sector committed to it, and we share and own our responsibility and contribution to make sure that we make progress together. The question that we all have for you is all these themes that many of you mentioned before us are very much in the center of the agenda of this weekend. Our question is, will you dedicate time, will you work in specific areas in which the private sector can partner with you to ensure that we make this opportunity a reality for all of us in the Americas? Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. Ahora
Thank you, Francisco. Now I would like to give the floor to Blanca Tribeño. She is the CEO of a Mexican enterprise, as a leader in services, information services. Well, thank you so much, and a good afternoon.
Today, Mr. President, Presidente Varela, Señora Presidenta, Presidente Peña Nieto. Nuestra generación va a trascender como aquella que logró.
Our generation is going to transcend that generation that connected humanity, the generation that made about 2 billion people come to the middle class, and including 4 million people in Latin America. I think that technology, in particular the technologies, the information technologies, telecommunications, have had a very important role in this progress. When we dominate technology, we're able to generate wealth, social well-being, and as President Obama says, this technology is here to stay, and they're transformational technologies. We've had great progress in different fronts, for instance, the access to broadband and legal frameworks. But before these great advances, our region will be as strong as our ability to embrace technology and take advantage of it. We have to make sure that we are as strong as our technological situation. This is a land of opportunities. In Mexico, we have about 100,000 engineers that graduate every year. We have programs like this one in Brazil, Argentina, and other countries in our region. With this type of panorama, the community of business people in communications technology, we all are committed in taking advantage of this talent. But of course, we have to make sure that we create a region that uses and creates technology. We have natural resources, we have manufacturing sectors that are robust, but we have to make sure that we understand the advancement of technology. That's why I'm so happy that President Obama mentioned this. We have to concentrate on technology and developing the talent that has to go with it. And this is how we're going to create this ecosystem, an ecosystem that will make sure that innovation moves forward and we can face challenges like the challenges that come from the Statistics and Labor Bureau in the United States. It foresees that in 2020 there will be a gap of over 1 million jobs for people that develop technology. We have to embrace the development of globalized societies with a different mentality. We have to embrace initiatives like 100,000 Strong by the president. So now, looking forward, how can we create a better political environment, a better financial environment? How can we work with the governments in this region to make sure that a technological sector moves forward? How can we improve our abilities to make sure that we create technology for the world? How can we create an economy that is boosted by technology? We have the opportunity, we have the people and the ideas. So let's develop the ecosystem that will take us to the next step. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Blanca. Now I'd like to give the floor to someone who doesn't need an introduction, Mark Zuckerberg, who is the president and founder of Facebook.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, so thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the business leaders who just spoke before me for the report that you all put together and all of your thoughts on how we can do better public and private partnerships. You know, connectivity is infrastructure that will help us solve all of the business and public challenges that we talked about here. Delivering connectivity is one of the ways that we can make sure that everyone has access to information for education, health information, information on how to get trained for and get access to new jobs, as well as a lot more. And I think that the best way to deliver this is through the kind of public and private partnerships that you've talked about here today. And for our part, at Facebook, we've helped found this organization, internet.org, where what we're trying to do is make it so that everyone around the world has access to at least some free basic internet services. So even if you can't afford to pay for full data access, you have the ability to access some information about health, some information about education, jobs, whatever local e-government services are relevant, and whatever other local content is relevant. So all of the leaders here on this panel have made connectivity a really important priority for your countries and have all made a lot of progress, and so I thank you for that. And my question is, what have you learned from making this a priority in terms of the lessons that you've picked up from all of the work that you've done, and what more can we be doing together to make sure that everyone in the world can be connected?
Muy bien, Mark. Muchas gracias a todos. Y ahora
Thank you all. Now I would like to go in the opposite direction. I would like to ask President Peña Nieto to make a few comments on his questions and on the opinions. Well, thank you so much, Luis Alberto. I know that these are all different questions, but I'd like to give you answers in a general way. As I said the first time I took the floor, the important and relevant character for a society, for its prosperity, which is in the participation of entrepreneurs. Part of the questions that was asked, are we disposed in this sense? Do we want to open to the participation of our entrepreneurs in the case of Mexico? That is exactly what we were saying. So I believe that the reforms that I referred to, at least some of the ones that I mentioned, are all geared toward opening greater participation spaces for the entrepreneurs in our country and the people that decide to invest in Mexico. But it's also true that one of the great challenges that we want to face, of course, generating prosperity. This all goes through the challenge that was described by President Varela and Obama. We need to make sure that we don't create a generation of greater inequality. That's why governments are there, to bring policies and the instruments, the tools that are necessary in order for those people that have created abilities to be able to bring their projects to fruition. And that's why we have carried out the reforms in Mexico. That's why we have made sure that the Development Bank gives greater loans. That's why we have had the programs in Mexico so that young entrepreneurs between the ages of 18 and 30 have access to credit. And that's why I believe that the reform in telecommunications that goes hand in hand with what Mark Zuckerberg was saying, the great challenge that it is today to have greater connectivity between our population and access to internet. In Mexico, not only are we working on this front, in Mexico it's a constitutional mandate, and it does give access to internet. Of course, there are spaces of participation to the national and foreign entrepreneurs that want to invest and accompany this effort and this obligation that the Mexican state has. I would conclude by saying that the challenges posed by connectivity, this inclusion, the digital inclusion, is the new alphabet. It's making sure that people are no longer illiterate in this sense. This is a tool to make sure that there is greater prosperity, that there is investment in science and technology, investment in innovation. And all of this, of course, is only achieved if there is an ideal climate for the development of entrepreneurship in our societies. And that's why we have to be responsible in making sure that our microeconomy is well managed, our public finances are well managed, and the reforms that open up the ability of entrepreneurs to participate in our countries. All of this strengthens the efforts that we referred to, that is to say, the regional integration. We want to make sure that our entrepreneurs participate in a regional and global market, and all this depends on the fact that they have a greater ability in their country of origin. That's what we want to achieve in Mexico. We want to be strong in this capacity, in our competitive abilities, so that our entrepreneurs participate in other markets as well. I do hope that with this statement and with this commitment, that it is clear Mexico is committed. Its government is committed. More than any other juncture, we are working within the materialization and implementation of reforms so that the entrepreneurs in our countries can grow and have a greater space to grow in. Thank you. Thank you so much. President Obama, you have the floor.
First of all, I want to thank the business leaders who are all here represented, and you had some great spokespersons in the front row. I'll just comment on a couple of themes that ran through a number of the questions. One of the advantages that we may have today that we didn't have, let's say, 15 or 20 or 30 years ago is I think it used to be viewed as either you have a government status economic model or you have a complete free market, and everything was very ideological sometimes in this region in discussing how economic development went forward. And I think by virtue of wisdom and some things that didn't work and some things that did, everybody around the region, throughout the hemisphere, I think has a very practical solution or a practical orientation. Maybe not everybody, but almost everybody. Certainly all the people on this stage. And so the question then becomes, what's the appropriate role for government? What's the appropriate role for the private sector? How do we fill gaps to get results? So I believe that the free market is the greatest wealth generator and innovator and is a recipe for success for countries. And I think it's very important for us to initiate reforms that can free up the entrepreneurship and the talents of our people. But I also think that there are going to be market failures. There are times where the market isn't meeting a social need that is necessary in order for businesses to thrive and societies to thrive. And so when Stanley talked about public-private partnerships, one way to think about it is, where is it that both businesses and government can work together to address a gap or a market failure? One area is in education. I think that we have to make a public investment through good schools, paying our teachers, training them properly, building infrastructure for schools. But one of the things that we've learned in the United States, for example, is that we have an outstanding community college system, not just the fancy universities at the top, but we also have community colleges throughout every state. But for too long, we weren't talking to businesses, and these community colleges weren't talking to businesses to ask, what should we be training people for, and how should we train them? And by soliciting input from business, suddenly the training programs in these community colleges became much more effective and were much more likely to lead to jobs in the future. That's the kind of collaboration that's, I think, very important. The same is true with respect to connectivity that Mark raised. Look, the internet wouldn't have been created without government investment. It didn't just kind of spring to life on its own. But now that in every country we recognize there's an infrastructure that has to be built, we also have to be working together with the private sector to make sure that it's built in a way that anticipates how rapidly things are changing, because there may be circumstances here where people can entirely leapfrog old technologies and go straight to new technologies. And so, you know, one of the questions I think all of us as leaders and regionally should be asking is, you know, to what extent are we making joint investments that aren't protecting the old models, but rather are opening up new models that may be more efficient and reach more people? Third point is regulatory issues came up a number of times. Look, technology and globalization are disruptive. And usually somebody's doing well with the status quo and they don't want change. And so sometimes breaking down regulations is painful politically. And that's why I'm very admiring of the work that Enrique did with respect to the energy sector in Mexico. That's a very sensitive thing and a very difficult thing. But what he recognized, and ultimately what all of Mexico recognized, is that that sector will not be as efficient if it does not get the kind of private input and investment and innovation that's required. So part of, I guess, our strategy has to be to recognize that there are going to be some regulatory barriers, and you know, we have to work in concert to try to break some of those down and harmonize regulations across countries and across, in some cases, industries. But in some cases, we may need new regulations to adapt to new times. And I'll use just the example of climate change to make this point. I visited the Panama Canal today, an amazing feat of human ingenuity. And the expansion that's going to be taking place here in Panama is going to be good for Panama, it's going to be good for world trade, it's going to be good for the region. But it turns out that the Panama Canal really depends on rain in Panama. If water is not coming down at a certain level, if seasonal rain patterns change radically, that can have an enormous impact on economic development, not just for Panama, but for the United States and for the entire region. So there is a circumstance where even as we end old regulations that no longer make sense or are inhibiting innovation and growth and investment, in some cases we may need new regulatory approaches to, for example, limit and reduce carbon, and we should do it in an efficient way so that we're harnessing the ingenuity of the private sector. You know, we set a bar, we set a price, we say, you know, you tell us how are you going to reduce carbon, but we need to reduce carbon to make sure that the rains still come so that the canal still works. And that approach to regulation, it's not so much you're for regulation or against regulation, but you're thinking, what regulations work today in a practical way to meet our goals? And how do we do it in a way that is the least bureaucratic and the least disruptive, but recognizing that there are still goals that have to be met? And the last point I would make is in terms of specific actions, this was raised earlier. Yeah, the United States is very committed to working with all the countries that are participating in the summit. We are consulting intensively on a bilateral basis, but we're also very interested in working on a regional level. I mentioned Central America. I've put forward a budget of $1 billion in investment in Central America to deal specifically with some of the issues of human investment in capital and youth, so that rather than young people feeling a sense of desperation and the only recourse they have is to join gangs or leave their country, that they can start an internet company using social media and start marketing goods that are produced in their own countries, in places all around the world. There's so much talent, there's so much ingenuity, but it does require some joint investment and recognizing that we have to think beyond our borders in order to do the right thing for our people. It is good for the United States for some young person in Honduras to have access to the internet, have access to education, and have access to opportunity. It's good for the United States if Brazil is growing at a rapid pace. It's good for the United States if Panama continues to thrive or Mexico is continuing to succeed. And the more we see our economies as mutually dependent rather than a zero-sum game, I think the more successful all of us will be. And so we'll take the list of all the business leaders and we'll work through those lists. I guarantee you that the United States will be more than open to making as much progress as we can before the next Summit of the Americas. And I'm confident that at least the three leaders on this stage, they'll be with me. And Luis also. All right.